The first rays of sunlight slipped through the holes in the broken roof of the abandoned hut, landing softly on the dusty floor where Grace lay awake. Sleep had abandoned her long before dawn. It wasn't the cold or the hard ground that kept her awake. It was the tiny kicks inside her swollen belly and the endless questions racing through her mind. She gently placed both hands over her stomach and smiled despite everything. "Good morning, my little one," she whispered. "We made it through another night." Her voice was soft, almost cheerful, even though there was very little to be cheerful about. Grace was only 25 years old. She was 8 months pregnant, and she had no home. The hut she slept in had once belonged to an old farmer who had died years earlier. No one wanted the crumbling building anymore. Its walls were cracked, its wooden door barely hung on rusty hinges, and every time it rained, water poured through the roof as though the sky itself had entered the room. Still, to Grace, it was better than sleeping under the trees. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, wincing as pain shot through her lower back. Pregnancy had become harder with each passing week. Walking exhausted her. Standing for too long made her legs swell. Yet she had no choice. If she didn't work, she wouldn't eat. She folded the thin wrapper she had used as a blanket and carefully swept the dusty floor with a bundle of dry palm leaves. Even in poverty, Grace believed a clean place brought peace. Her mother had taught her that years ago. The memory brought tears to her eyes. Her parents had died in a road accident when she was 19. Since then, life had seemed determined to test every ounce of strength she possessed. She wiped her eyes before the tears could fall. "Crying won't feed us," she said quietly to herself. Outside, the village was slowly coming alive. Roosters crowed in different compounds. Women balanced empty buckets on their heads as they walked toward the stream. Children chased one another along the dusty paths, laughing as though life had never heard of sorrow. Grace watched them for a moment before picking up the old woven basket she used to collect firewood. Today had to be a good day. She only had a handful of dried cassava left. If she couldn't sell enough firewood before evening, she and her unborn baby would go to bed hungry again. As she stepped onto the narrow dirt road, a few villagers greeted her kindly. "Good morning, Grace." She smiled warmly. "Good morning." Not everyone treated her badly. There was old Mama Esther, who occasionally gave her leftover soup. There was little Kofi, a cheerful boy who often shared mangoes he picked from his father's farm. And there was Pastor Samuel, who reminded everyone during Sunday services that kindness cost nothing. But kindness was rare. Many people judged her before hearing her story. To them, she was simply the pregnant homeless woman. Some assumed she had been careless. Others believed God was punishing her. Very few knew the truth. Months earlier, Grace had been happily married. Her husband, Peter, had once promised to love her forever. He had held her hands beneath the village church altar and vowed never to leave her. Grace had believed every word. For the first year, life had been peaceful. They rented a small room in a nearby town. Peter repaired motorcycles while Grace sold vegetables in the market. They dreamed of saving enough money to build a tiny house. Then Peter changed. He began coming home late. He stopped smiling. Sometimes he disappeared for days without explanation. Whenever Grace asked questions, he accused her of being controlling. When she discovered she was pregnant, she believed the baby would heal their marriage. Instead, it destroyed what little remained. One evening, Peter returned home with another woman. Without shame, he announced that he no longer loved Grace. He said the new woman came from a wealthy family and could help him become successful. Grace had stared at him in disbelief. "What about our child?" she had asked through tears. Peter had shrugged. "I didn't ask you to keep it." Those words had pierced deeper than any knife. Within a week, he had thrown her out of the house. She went to his parents. They refused to let her in. She traveled to her own relatives. They were struggling to survive and could barely feed themselves. Some advised her to abandon the pregnancy. Others told her to disappear. Feeling unwanted everywhere she turned, Grace walked until she reached the quiet farming village of Umudara. She had arrived with nothing except a small bag of clothes and hope. Hope was all she had left. A loud voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace! She turned. Mama Esther was waving from outside her small mud house. Come here. Grace hurried over. The elderly woman smiled kindly and handed her 2 boiled sweet potatoes wrapped in banana leaves. You look thinner every day. Grace hesitated. Mama, I can't keep taking your food. Nonsense, the old woman replied. A hungry mother cannot raise a healthy child. Grace accepted the food gratefully. Thank you. May God bless you. He already has, Mama Esther answered with a smile. He sent you here to remind us that kindness still matters. Grace hugged the old woman before continuing toward the forest. The morning air was cool. Birds sang from tall trees. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting golden patterns across the ground. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Grace carefully gathered dry branches one by one, placing them inside her basket. She worked slowly because bending over had become difficult. Every few minutes she paused to catch her breath. Sweat rolled down her face despite the cool weather. The baby kicked again. She laughed softly. I know, she whispered. You're hungry too. Around noon she sat beneath a large tree to eat the sweet potatoes Mama Esther had given her. She broke off a tiny piece and held it against her belly. This is for both of us. Though she was alone, talking to her unborn child made loneliness feel smaller. After finishing her meal, she drank from a nearby stream and returned to gathering wood. Hours passed. Her basket gradually filled. It wasn't enough. She needed more. The deeper parts of the forest had larger fallen branches that sold for better prices. Most villagers avoided that area because wild animals occasionally wandered through. Grace knew the risk, but hunger often forced people to choose danger. She tightened the faded wrapper around her waist and continued deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller. The path became narrower. Even the birds seemed quieter. A strange feeling settled over her. She looked around cautiously. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt different. She shook her head. You're imagining things. Just as she bent to pick up another branch, a distant sound drifted through the trees. Help! Grace froze. She listened carefully. Perhaps she had imagined it. Then it came again. Please, somebody help me. It was unmistakably a man's voice. Weak, desperate, filled with fear. Her heart began pounding. She looked around, expecting someone else to answer. There was no one. The forest had become eerily silent. Every sensible thought told her to turn around and run back to the village. She was heavily pregnant. She had no weapon. Whoever was shouting could be a criminal, or it could be a trap. She took one step backward. Then another cry echoed through the trees. This time it sounded even more desperate. Help me! Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment. What if that were me? She whispered. She thought of all the times people had ignored her suffering. She remembered how it felt to be abandoned. She couldn't walk away knowing someone else was begging for help. Even if she was afraid. Even if she was carrying a child. Taking a deep breath, Grace set down her basket of firewood. She picked up the only thing she had that resembled a weapon, a small rusty knife she used for cutting branches. It wouldn't do much against dangerous men or wild animals, but it was all she had. Holding the knife tightly, Grace slowly followed the cries deeper into the forest. With every step, the voice became louder, closer, more desperate. She pushed aside thick bushes, her heart hammering against her chest. Then, just beyond a cluster of ancient trees, she caught sight of something that made her stop in disbelief. A man was tied tightly to the trunk of a massive tree. His expensive clothes were torn. His face was bruised. His wrists bled where rough ropes dug into his skin. He looked exhausted. The moment he saw Grace, his eyes filled with hope. Please, he whispered hoarsely. Help me. Grace took a step toward him. Then a deep, terrifying growl echoed through the forest. She slowly turned her head. Emerging from the tall grass, no more than 30 feet away, was a full-grown lion. Its golden eyes were fixed on the helpless man tied to the tree, and it was moving closer. Grace's blood ran cold. For one horrifying moment, she forgot how to breathe. Grace's heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. The lion was enormous. Its golden mane shimmered beneath the afternoon sun that filtered through the trees. Every slow step it took sent chills through Grace's body. Its eyes never left the helpless man tied to the tree. The stranger's breathing became faster. "Please," he whispered, barely able to speak. "Don't leave me." Grace tightened her grip on the rusty knife in her trembling hand. The tiny blade suddenly felt ridiculous. What could a worn-out knife possibly do against a fully grown lion? Nothing. She looked down at her swollen belly. Her baby kicked gently, as though reminding her that she wasn't alone. Fear screamed at her to run. No one would blame a pregnant woman for saving herself. She could turn around now, race back to the village, and tell the hunters what she had seen. Perhaps they would arrive in time. Perhaps they wouldn't. But another voice spoke inside her heart. If she left, the man would almost certainly die. She remembered the day Peter threw her out of their home. She remembered begging him not to abandon her. She remembered standing in the rain with nowhere to go while people passed by pretending not to notice. She knew exactly what it felt like to be left helpless. "I can't leave him," she whispered. The lion growled again. Its tail swished slowly from side to side as it moved closer to its prey. Grace quickly searched the area. There had to be something. Anything. She spotted several dry bushes scattered around the clearing. Nearby lay fallen branches and brittle leaves baked by the afternoon sun. Then she remembered something her father had taught her when she was a little girl. Wild animals often feared fire more than people. She had no lighter, no matches. Then her eyes fell on two large stones lying beside a tree. Her father had once shown her how hunters sometimes created sparks by striking certain stones together. It wasn't easy. It wasn't guaranteed. But it was her only chance. Moving as quietly as possible, Grace crouched behind a bush and picked up the stones. The lion hadn't noticed her. Its attention remained fixed on the tied man. Grace struck the stones together. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. Her breathing became quicker. "Hurry," she whispered. The lion took another step. The stranger squeezed his eyes shut. Grace struck the stones harder. A tiny spark appeared before disappearing instantly. Hope filled her heart. She quickly gathered dry grass into a small pile. Again she struck the stones. Another spark. Then another. Finally, a tiny thread of smoke rose from the grass. "Come on," she pleaded. A small flame suddenly flickered to life. Grace carefully blew on it. The flame grew larger. She grabbed a long dry branch and pushed one end into the fire until it caught. Within seconds she held a burning torch. Now came the dangerous part. Drawing every ounce of courage she possessed, Grace stepped out from behind the bushes. "Hey!" she shouted as loudly as she could. The lion immediately turned toward her. His piercing eyes locked onto hers. Grace's knees nearly gave way. The beast released a deafening roar that echoed through the forest. Every instinct inside her begged her to run. Instead, she raised the burning branch high above her head. She waved it wildly while screaming, "Go away!" The lion hesitated. Fire. It didn't like fire. Grace picked up another burning stick from the small fire and threw it toward the animal. The flaming branch landed a few feet in front of the lion. Startled, it jumped backward. Grace refused to stop shouting. She grabbed handfuls of dry leaves and tossed them into the flames, creating thick smoke. The clearing quickly filled with the smell of burning wood. The lion paced angrily. It growled. It roared again. But it no longer moved toward the helpless man. Instead, it slowly began backing away. Grace refused to lower the torch. "Leave." The lion stared at her one last time before turning and disappearing into the thick forest. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Grace remained frozen for several seconds, making sure the animal wasn't coming back. Only when she could no longer hear its footsteps did she lower the torch. Her entire body shook. She had survived. The stranger looked at her in complete disbelief. I thought I was dead." Grace hurried toward him. "We have to leave before it comes back." She used her rusty knife to cut through the thick ropes. The old blade struggled against the coarse fibers. Her hands ached. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Finally, the last rope snapped. The man collapsed to the ground. His wrists were raw and bleeding. His ankles were badly swollen. He tried to stand but immediately fell again. Grace quickly knelt beside him. "Can you walk?" He shook his head. "My legs. They've been tied for hours." Grace looked around nervously. The lion could return at any moment. "We have to move." The man looked at her swollen stomach. "You shouldn't be helping me." Grace smiled weakly. "If we stay here, neither of us will survive." She wrapped one of his arms over her shoulder. Though heavily pregnant, she slowly helped him stand. He leaned heavily against her. Together they began the difficult journey through the forest. Every few steps the man stumbled. Grace paused often to let him rest. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Their only goal was reaching safety. At last they arrived beside the small stream where Grace had eaten earlier that afternoon. She gently helped him sit beneath a large tree. "You need water." She cupped water in her hands and offered it to him. He drank greedily. Then she carefully cleaned the blood from his wrists using strips torn from the edge of her wrapper. The man watched her quietly. "You don't even know my name." Grace smiled. "No. Yet you risked your life for me." She shrugged. "You were in danger. Most people would have run. I almost did." He stared at her. "What changed your mind?" Grace looked down at the flowing water. "I know what it feels like to be abandoned." The man remained silent. After a moment he asked softly, "What's your name?" "Grace." He smiled for the first time. "It suits you." She laughed quietly. "And yours?" There was a brief pause. "My name is Daniel." He intentionally stopped there. He didn't mention his surname. He didn't reveal that newspapers often called him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. He didn't say that he owned one of Africa's fastest-growing construction and technology companies. Right now, none of that mattered. Grace had saved him because she believed he was simply another human being, not because of his wealth. That realization humbled him. Grace noticed the expensive watch still attached to his wrist. It was scratched but clearly valuable. His shoes alone probably cost more than anything she had ever owned. "You don't look like someone from around here." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm not." "What happened?" His expression darkened. "I came to inspect some farmland for a new agricultural project." Grace nodded. "And then?" "My driver stopped the vehicle because a tree had fallen across the road." His voice became heavier. "It was a trap." Grace listened carefully. "Several armed men came out of the bushes. They killed my driver." Grace gasped. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "They knocked out my security guard." "What about you?" "They wanted something." "What?" "My company's access codes." Grace frowned. "You didn't tell them?" "I couldn't." He looked toward the forest. "When they realized I wouldn't cooperate, they tied me to that tree." Grace's face turned pale. "They wanted the lion to finish the job." Daniel nodded slowly. "That way my death would look like an accident." A chill ran through Grace's body. Whoever had done this hadn't simply wanted to rob him. They had wanted him dead. She reached into her basket and removed the 2 pieces of dried cassava she had saved for dinner. It was all she had. She broke one piece in half and handed it to Daniel. "You need to eat." He looked at the small piece of food. "And you?" "I'll be fine." "No." He divided it again. "We'll share." Grace smiled. Together they ate in silence. To Daniel, it was the simplest meal he had eaten in years. Yet somehow it tasted better than many expensive dinners. Perhaps because it had been offered with genuine kindness. After resting for nearly an hour, Daniel managed to stand on his own. "I think I can walk now." "Good. My hut isn't far." He looked surprised. "You have a house?" Grace laughed softly. "I wouldn't call it that." As they slowly continued toward the village, Daniel learned more about the woman who had saved his life. She told him about losing her parents. She told him about Peter leaving her after discovering another woman. She admitted she had nowhere else to go. Daniel listened without interrupting. Every word deepened his admiration. Despite everything life had taken from her, Grace had refused to become bitter. She still smiled. She still believed in helping others. She still trusted that tomorrow could be better. As the old abandoned hut finally came into view at the edge of the village, Daniel stopped walking. He stared at the broken roof, the cracked mud walls, and the patched doorway hanging crooked on worn-out hinges. "You live here?" Grace nodded with an embarrassed smile. "It's not much." Daniel looked at the tiny shelter. The woman who had just saved his life from a lion slept in a place that barely protected her from the rain. For the first time in many years, Daniel felt ashamed of how easily he had taken comfort for granted. He silently made himself a promise. He would never allow Grace's act of courage to go unrewarded. But first, he needed to survive long enough to keep that promise. Neither of them noticed that, far away along the dirt road leading into the village, a convoy of black SUVs had just turned the corner. Daniel's security team had finally found his trail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tiny village as Grace slowly led Daniel toward the abandoned hut she called home. Every step seemed to drain the little strength he had left. His expensive clothes were torn beyond recognition. His shoes were covered in mud, and dried blood stained the sleeves of his once pristine white shirt. Grace glanced at him every few moments. "Are you sure you can keep walking?" Daniel forced a weak smile. "I've survived this long. I can make it a little farther." "Don't try to be brave," Grace replied gently. "If you fall, it will only make things harder." Daniel couldn't help but chuckle. "You sound like a doctor." Grace laughed. "No, just someone who's had to take care of herself for a long time." Within a few minutes they reached the old hut. Daniel stopped outside and stared at the building. The mud walls were cracked from years of neglect. The roof was patched together with old zinc sheets, palm leaves, and pieces of wood. The windows had no shutters, only torn sacks hanging to keep out the wind. It looked more like a forgotten storage shed than a home. Yet Grace smiled proudly. "It's not much," she said, "but it's dry most of the time." Daniel looked at her. "You've been living here?" "For almost 5 months." "Alone?" She nodded. "Just me and my baby." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. A woman who had nothing, a woman who had been abandoned, a woman carrying a child, had still chosen to risk her own life to save a complete stranger. People often praised themselves for generosity after donating money they would never miss. Grace had given something far more valuable. She had risked her life. Without saying another word, Grace pushed open the crooked wooden door. The room inside was tiny. There was no electricity, no bed, no wardrobe. One corner held a rolled-up mat made from woven reeds. Another corner contained a small clay stove with a black cooking pot resting on top. A few neatly folded clothes sat inside an old basket. That was almost everything Grace owned. Daniel looked around quietly. The place was unbelievably poor. Yet it was spotless. The floor had been carefully swept. The cooking utensils had been washed. Even the little window had been cleaned. Grace noticed him looking around. "I'm sorry," she said shyly. "I wasn't expecting visitors." Daniel shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for." She smiled. "Sit down before your legs give up." Daniel lowered himself carefully onto the woven mat. As soon as he sat down, exhaustion overwhelmed him. The events of the day finally caught up with him. His body ached everywhere. Grace quickly fetched a small calabash filled with water. "You should wash those wounds." She knelt beside him and gently cleaned the rope burns on his wrists. Daniel winced. "Sorry." "It's all right." She tore another strip from the edge of her wrapper and wrapped it around the wounds. "It isn't much, but it'll stop the bleeding." Daniel looked at her with surprise. "Where did you learn this?" "My mother." Grace smiled sadly. She always treated cuts with clean cloth and herbs. She stood and walked outside. "I'll be back." A few minutes later she returned carrying several green leaves. Daniel watched curiously. Grace crushed them between 2 stones until they formed a thick paste. "My mother used these whenever we got injured." "You think they'll help?" "They always did." She carefully spread the paste over the wounds. The cool herbs immediately soothed the burning pain. Daniel stared at her. "You're full of surprises." Grace laughed. "In the village, everyone knows a little medicine." Daniel smiled. "I grew up in the city." "It shows." They both laughed softly. For the first time since his kidnapping, Daniel felt safe. Outside, the evening breeze carried the sounds of children playing and women returning from the farms. Inside the tiny hut, an unexpected peace settled over them. Grace lit a small kerosene lamp as darkness slowly filled the room. "I'm afraid dinner isn't very exciting." She opened a small basket and removed the last handful of cassava flour. Daniel frowned. "That's all you have?" Grace nodded. "I was hoping to sell more firewood today." She smiled awkwardly. "But I suppose rescuing strangers changed my plans." Daniel lowered his eyes. She was giving him her last meal. Without complaint, without hesitation, Grace mixed the cassava with hot water and prepared a simple meal. There was no soup, only plain cassava and a pinch of salt. She divided it equally between 2 old bowls. Daniel stared at the food. "When did you last eat?" "This afternoon." "And before that?" She hesitated. "I skipped breakfast." Daniel immediately pushed his bowl toward her. "You should eat more." Grace shook her head. "We'll share." "But you're pregnant." "So? You need it more than I do." Grace smiled warmly. "My mother always said food tastes better when shared." Daniel had attended banquets where tables stretched across enormous halls. He had eaten meals prepared by world-famous chefs. Yet somehow this simple cassava tasted better than all of them. Not because of the food, because of the heart behind it. After dinner, Daniel leaned against the wall. The kerosene lamp flickered gently. "Grace. Why did your husband leave?" She remained silent for several seconds. "I ask myself that every day." "You still love him?" Grace looked into the tiny flame. "I loved the man I married." She paused. "But the man who abandoned me was a stranger." Daniel nodded quietly. "My father used to tell me something." "What?" "People reveal who they truly are when life becomes difficult." Grace smiled sadly. "Then Peter revealed himself." Daniel looked thoughtful. "And you? What about me?" "You had every reason to become bitter." She shrugged. "I tried. And it made me miserable." "So you chose kindness instead?" Grace nodded. "Hatred only creates more pain." Daniel smiled. "You're stronger than you think." A knock suddenly echoed on the door. Grace looked surprised. Who could that be? She opened it. Standing outside was old Mama Esther carrying a small lantern. "My child," the elderly woman said, "I saw you return with someone." Grace smiled. "Yes." Mama Esther looked at Daniel. "Oh my! What happened to him?" Grace briefly explained how she had found him tied to a tree. The old woman's eyes widened. "You fought off a lion?" Grace laughed nervously. "I mostly shouted." Mama Esther shook her head in amazement. "You've always had a brave heart." She handed Grace a small bowl. "I made extra vegetable soup." Grace's face brightened. "Mama, take it." The old woman smiled. "I had a feeling you'd have a guest." Daniel stood respectfully. "Thank you." Mama Esther smiled kindly. "Any friend of Grace is welcome." After she left, Daniel quietly asked, "Does she always help you?" "When she can." "And the others?" Grace's smile faded slightly. "Some help. Some pretend I don't exist." Daniel nodded. He knew that would soon change. The following morning, Grace woke before sunrise. She expected Daniel to still be asleep. Instead, she found him sitting outside watching the sky. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough." "How are your wrists?" "Better." Grace smiled. "The herbs worked." "They certainly did." She prepared breakfast. There was only boiled water and the last piece of cassava. Again she split it in half. Daniel accepted it reluctantly. As they ate, a faint sound echoed through the village. Engines. Many engines. Grace looked up. "Do you hear that?" Daniel stood. He knew that sound. Within moments, Dust rose along the village road. Children stopped playing. Farmers looked toward the entrance. Women whispered nervously. Then they appeared. 1, 2, 5, 10 black luxury SUVs rolled slowly into the village one behind another. The entire village froze. No one had ever seen so many expensive vehicles together. The convoy stopped directly in front of Grace's hut. Doors flew open. More than 20 heavily built security officers jumped out. Several men in dark suits hurried toward the hut. One of them looked around desperately before his eyes landed on Daniel. "Sir!" He ran forward. "We found you!" Another man immediately embraced Daniel. "Thank God you're alive. We searched everywhere." The security officers quickly formed a protective circle around him. Grace stepped backward in confusion. She looked from the men, to the SUVs, back to Daniel. The respectful way everyone addressed him made it clear. He wasn't an ordinary businessman. One of the men turned to Grace. "Ma'am." He bowed respectfully. "Thank you for saving Mr. Daniel Cole." Grace frowned. "Daniel Cole?" The man nodded. "Yes, our chairman, our founder, the owner of Cole Global Holdings." Grace looked at Daniel in disbelief. "The billionaire?" Daniel sighed softly. "I was hoping to tell you myself." Her eyes grew even wider. She had heard the name before. Everyone had. Cole Global Holdings built roads, hospitals, schools, and technology centers across the country. Its owner was one of the richest and most respected businessmen in Africa. The man sitting on her floor, the man who had shared plain cassava with her, the man she had rescued from a lion, was that Daniel Cole. Grace was speechless. Daniel walked toward her. "I didn't hide my identity because I didn't trust you." "Then why?" He smiled warmly. "Because for the first time in years, someone cared whether I lived or died without knowing how much money I had." Grace lowered her eyes. "I only did what anyone should do." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, most people wouldn't have." He turned toward his head of security. "This woman saved my life. If she hadn't found me yesterday, I wouldn't be standing here today." Every security officer looked at Grace with admiration. Daniel reached into his pocket and removed a small business card. He placed it gently into Grace's hand. "I have something to ask." She looked up. "When you're ready. I want you to come to the city." Grace blinked. "The city?" He nodded. "I want to give you a proper home, a good job, and the medical care you and your baby deserve." Grace stood frozen. She had gone into the forest looking for firewood. She had returned with something she never imagined. A chance to begin life again. As Daniel climbed into the waiting SUV, he looked back one final time. Their eyes met. Neither of them realized that the simple act of kindness in a lonely forest had just changed both of their lives forever. Grace stood at the entrance of her little hut, staring at the business card Daniel had placed in her hand. The convoy of black SUVs had long disappeared down the dusty village road, but the cloud of dust they left behind still lingered in the air. Everything had happened so quickly that it felt like a dream. Yesterday she had been collecting firewood. Yesterday she had almost become food for a lion. Yesterday she had rescued a stranger tied to a tree. Now she knew that stranger was one of the richest businessmen in Africa. She looked down at the elegant card once more. Daniel Cole, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Cole Global Holdings. The words seemed unreal. Grace carefully slipped the card into the small cloth purse hanging around her neck. It was the safest place she had. That evening the entire village buzzed with excitement. Children ran from house to house telling everyone about the convoy of luxury vehicles. Men gathered beneath the old Irako tree discussing the famous businessman who had appeared in their tiny village. Women whispered about the homeless pregnant woman who somehow knew the billionaire. Some believed Grace had been lucky. Others believed she had lied about knowing nothing about Daniel. A few even suggested she had planned everything. Grace ignored the rumors. She had spent too much of her life worrying about what people thought. As darkness settled over the village, Mama Esther came to visit. She carried a small basket filled with roasted corn and oranges. "I knew you wouldn't have cooked tonight," the old woman said. Grace smiled warmly. You know me too well. Mama Esther sat beside her. So, Grace laughed softly. I know what you're about to ask. Do you? You want to know whether I'm going? The old woman nodded eagerly. Are you? Grace looked toward the doorway. I don't know. Why? What if I don't belong there? Mama Esther frowned. What do you mean? I've never lived in a city. I've never worked in an office. I barely finished secondary school. She rubbed her swollen stomach. And look at me. I'm 8 months pregnant. What company would want someone like me? Mama Esther reached across and gently held her hand. My child. Daniel Cole didn't invite you because of your education. He invited you because of your heart. Grace lowered her eyes. You think so? I know so. The old woman smiled. A person can hire someone with experience. But kindness, courage, honesty, those things are much harder to find. Grace felt hope quietly growing inside her heart. Perhaps this was the opportunity God had been preparing for all along. 3 days later, another black SUV arrived in the village. This time only 2 people stepped out. One was a middle-aged woman dressed in a navy blue business suit. The other was a young driver carrying several shopping bags. The woman walked toward Grace with a warm smile. Good morning. Are you Grace? Yes. My name is Helen. I work for Mr. Daniel Cole. She handed Grace an envelope. He asked me to give this to you. Grace opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. Dear Grace, I hope you and your baby are doing well. Thank you again for saving my life. No words will ever be enough. If you are willing, I would like you to come to Lagos. Everything has been prepared for your arrival. Please don't worry about expenses. They are my responsibility. I have arranged a comfortable place for you to stay and medical care for your pregnancy. After your baby is born, I would like to offer you a position at Cole Global Holdings. I hope you will accept. Your grateful friend, Daniel Cole. Tears filled Grace's eyes. No one had ever written her such a thoughtful letter. Helen smiled. Mr. Cole specifically asked that you never feel pressured. He said the choice must be yours. Grace folded the letter carefully. I'll go. Helen smiled broadly. I was hoping you'd say that. Leaving the village was harder than Grace expected. Mama Esther hugged her tightly. Don't forget us. Never. Little Kofi ran toward her carrying a tiny carved wooden bird. I made this for your baby. Grace hugged him. Thank you. Even villagers who had rarely spoken to her came to wish her well. Some apologized for judging her. Others simply smiled. Grace climbed into the waiting SUV with tears in her eyes. As the vehicle drove away, she looked back through the window. The little abandoned hut grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared. She silently thanked God for carrying her through the darkest season of her life. Grace had never traveled in such a luxurious vehicle. The seats were softer than any bed she had ever slept on. Cool air flowed from hidden vents. Soft music played quietly through speakers. She was almost afraid to touch anything. Helen noticed. You can relax. Grace smiled shyly. I'm afraid I'll break something. Helen laughed. Mr. Cole would probably buy another one. Grace couldn't help laughing too. The long drive to Lagos seemed to pass in a blur. The closer they came to the city, the larger everything became. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky. Cars filled every road. Huge digital billboards flashed colorful advertisements. People hurried in every direction. Grace pressed her face against the window like a curious child. I've never seen anything like this. Helen smiled. You'll get used to it. I don't think I ever will. The SUV finally turned through enormous iron gates. Grace looked up. Before her stood a magnificent modern mansion surrounded by beautiful gardens. Water danced from elegant fountains. Flowers bloomed everywhere. Uniformed security guards stood at attention. Grace's mouth slowly fell open. Helen smiled. No, this isn't where you'll be staying. Grace blinked. It isn't. This is Mr. Cole's home. The vehicle continued another 5 minutes before stopping outside a beautiful 2-story guest house. "This one is yours." Grace stared in disbelief. "Mine?" Helen nodded. "For as long as you need it." Grace climbed out slowly. The guest house was larger than every building in her village combined. Inside, polished marble floors reflected the sunlight. The living room contained comfortable sofas. The kitchen was fully equipped. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs. Each had a large comfortable bed. Grace gently touched the mattress. It was unbelievably soft. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to sleep on a real bed. Unable to hold back her emotions any longer, she burst into tears. Helen hurried over. "What's wrong?" Grace wiped her face. "I've spent months sleeping on the floor. I never imagined." She couldn't finish. Helen gently embraced her. "You deserve kindness too." The next morning Daniel visited. He looked much healthier than when Grace had rescued him. His wrists had almost completely healed. He smiled warmly as Grace welcomed him inside. "How are you settling in?" "I'm still wondering if this is real." Daniel laughed. "It's very real." Grace thanked him repeatedly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Daniel shook his head. "You already did. You saved my life." Grace smiled. "I suppose we're even." Daniel laughed. "Not even close." They sat together for tea. Daniel explained that although he had promised her a job, her health came first. "For now, I want you to focus on your pregnancy." Grace nodded. "And after the baby? I'll personally train you." Grace looked surprised. "You?" Daniel smiled. "I think you're worth investing in." A week later, Grace visited Cole Global Holdings for the first time. The headquarters towered above the surrounding buildings. Its glass exterior sparkled beneath the morning sun. Grace stopped walking. "It's enormous." Daniel smiled. "It keeps me busy." Inside, employees greeted Daniel respectfully. "Good morning, sir." "Morning, Mr. Cole." Everyone seemed to know him. Grace quietly followed beside him. People immediately noticed the pregnant young woman. Whispers spread through the building. "Who's she? I've never seen her before. Is she related to Mr. Cole?" She came in with the chairman. Several curious eyes followed them through the lobby. Daniel ignored the whispers. He led Grace into the executive floor. "This will be your workplace after your maternity leave." Grace admired everything. The offices were modern. The atmosphere was professional. People moved confidently from one meeting to another. Felt like another world. Daniel introduced her to several department managers. Most welcomed her politely. Others forced polite smiles. One woman barely looked at Grace before returning to her computer. Grace noticed but said nothing. Not everyone would like her. She understood that. Standing near the glass wall overlooking the city was a tall man in an expensive gray suit. He appeared to be in his late 30s. Sharp eyes, perfectly combed hair, a calm smile. Daniel walked toward him. "Grace, this is Victor Adams, my executive assistant." Victor extended his hand politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Grace smiled and shook it. "The pleasure is mine." Victor looked at her for only a second longer than necessary. His smile never disappeared, but something about his eyes felt cold. Daniel noticed nothing unusual. "Victor has worked with me for nearly 10 years. He's one of the people I trust most." Victor nodded modestly. "I simply do my job." Grace smiled politely. She had no reason to doubt him. None at all. Yet as Daniel showed her the rest of the building, Victor remained standing exactly where they had left him. His pleasant smile slowly faded. His eyes narrowed as he watched Grace disappear down the hallway. He quietly slipped his phone from his pocket. After making sure no one was nearby, he dialed a number. The call connected almost immediately. Victor lowered his voice. "The woman is here." A deep voice answered from the other end. "The one from the village?" "Yes." "Is she a problem?" Victor stared toward the hallway. "I don't know yet." There was a brief silence. Then the voice spoke again. "Find out." Victor ended the call. A slow smile returned to his face before anyone could notice. Grace had no idea. As far as she was concerned, she had just met Daniel's loyal assistant. She never imagined she had also come face to face with the man who wanted Daniel dead. Grace had been in Lagos for nearly 3 weeks, but every morning she still woke up expecting to see the cracked roof of the abandoned hut in Umadara village. Instead, she opened her eyes to a bright bedroom filled with sunlight streaming through elegant white curtains. The room smelled of fresh flowers, and the soft mattress beneath her still felt like a luxury she had not earned. Sometimes she simply lay still for a few moments, thanking God for bringing her this far. Life had changed so quickly, yet she never forgot where she had come from. She still folded her blankets neatly every morning. She still swept the floor even though a housekeeper visited every afternoon. She still washed her own dishes whenever she could. The staff often laughed kindly. "Madam Grace," one of them said one morning, "you don't have to do these things." Grace smiled. "I know. Then why do you?" "Because I don't want comfort to make me forget gratitude." The elderly housekeeper smiled warmly. "You truly are different." Daniel kept his promise. He made sure Grace attended every medical appointment with one of the city's best obstetricians. Every scan showed that the baby was healthy. "The little one is growing perfectly," Dr. Amina said during one appointment. Grace smiled with relief. "And the mother?" The doctor laughed. "The mother needs more rest." Grace glanced at Daniel, who was sitting quietly beside her. "I told you," he said with a teasing smile. Grace rolled her eyes playfully. "You've been working too hard. I only organize a few files. You organize them for hours." She laughed. "I get bored sitting at home." Daniel shook his head. "I'd rather have a bored Grace than an exhausted Grace." The doctor smiled as she watched them. "You two argue like old friends." Neither of them answered. Instead, they exchanged awkward smiles. Over the following weeks, Daniel occasionally invited Grace to visit the company headquarters. She wasn't officially working yet, but he wanted her to become familiar with the business. He explained how different departments operated. "This floor handles finance. The next one oversees construction projects. Our legal team is on the 17th floor." Grace listened carefully. She asked questions whenever she didn't understand something. Daniel never made her feel embarrassed. Instead, he answered patiently. "You learn quickly," he told her one afternoon. Grace smiled. "I've had a good teacher." "No, you've had determination." As they walked through the building, employees began recognizing Grace. Most greeted her politely. "Good morning, Miss Grace. How are you feeling today? When is the baby due?" She answered every greeting with kindness. Within days, people noticed something unusual. Grace remembered everyone's names. The cleaners, the receptionists, the security guards, the cafeteria workers. She treated each person with exactly the same respect she gave the executives. Word spread quickly. "She's nothing like the other VIP guests. I've never seen her ignore anyone. She even thanked me for opening the door." Many employees quietly admired her. Not everyone did. From his office, Victor Adams watched everything. He noticed the smiles. He noticed the conversations. He noticed Daniel laughing more than he had in years. None of it pleased him. Victor had spent almost a decade becoming Daniel's most trusted advisor. He knew every major contract, every investment, every financial decision. Daniel trusted him completely, or at least he had. Then Grace arrived. Suddenly Daniel was distracted. He left work earlier than usual to take Grace to medical appointments. He asked Victor to handle meetings while he visited the guest house. Victor smiled whenever Daniel mentioned Grace. But inside, his hatred grew. Late one evening, long after most employees had gone home, Victor locked his office door. He walked toward a hidden cabinet behind a bookshelf. Carefully, he entered a 6-digit code. The cabinet opened. Inside sat a small laptop that was never connected to the company's network. Victor switched it on. Within seconds, an encrypted messaging application appeared. A message was already waiting. "Update." Victor typed slowly. Daniel survived because of the village woman. The reply came almost immediately. We know. Victor frowned. Another message appeared. She wasn't supposed to find him. Victor's jaw tightened. It was bad luck. The sender answered with only 3 words. Fix your mistake. Victor leaned back in his chair. He hated being spoken to like that, especially considering who he really was. He wasn't merely helping strangers eliminate Daniel. He had his own reasons. Years earlier, Victor's father had been one of Daniel Cole's business partners. After a disastrous investment, Victor blamed Daniel for his father's financial ruin. His father eventually died from stress-related illness. Victor never forgave Daniel. Whether Daniel was actually responsible no longer mattered. Hatred had become Victor's truth. Revenge had become his purpose. For 10 years he had patiently earned Daniel's trust. He had waited, planned, prepared. The kidnapping had been the perfect opportunity. Everything had gone according to plan, until a homeless pregnant woman walked into the forest. Victor slammed the laptop shut. Grace, he muttered, you've become a problem. The following morning, Daniel called Victor into his office. I have something I'd like you to arrange. Of course, sir. I want Grace enrolled in one of the best business administration courses after the baby is born. Victor kept smiling. An excellent idea. She has potential. I agree. Daniel leaned back. I've rarely met someone with such integrity. Victor nodded. She's certainly memorable. Daniel laughed. I don't know what I'd have done without her. Victor felt his stomach tighten. You owe her your life. I do. Daniel looked out the window. I've spent years wondering whether genuine kindness still exists. Grace reminded me that it does. Victor forced another smile. I'll make the arrangements. As he left the office, the smile disappeared. Daniel wasn't simply grateful. He was emotionally attached. That made Grace even more dangerous. Meanwhile, Grace was settling comfortably into city life. One Saturday afternoon, she visited a nearby market with Helen. Everything fascinated her. Rows of colorful fabrics, fresh fruits stacked high, the smell of roasted corn, street musicians playing cheerful songs. Helen laughed as Grace stopped to admire almost every stall. You really haven't been here before. Grace smiled. The biggest market I've ever seen before this was the one near my village. She bought only a few baby clothes. Simple ones. Helen noticed. You can afford more. Grace shook her head. The baby doesn't need expensive things. He needs love. Helen smiled. Daniel was right. About what? You're impossible not to admire. Grace laughed. I don't think everyone agrees. Back at Cole Global Holdings, Victor was quietly putting another plan into motion. He entered the office of one of the junior accountants. Good afternoon. The young man stood quickly. Sir. Victor placed a confidential-looking file on the desk. I need these financial records updated. Today. Immediately. The accountant nodded. Of course. As Victor walked away, a faint smile appeared. The file contained deliberately altered figures. If processed correctly, millions of naira would disappear through fake consulting payments. The missing money would eventually be blamed on another executive. Daniel would waste months investigating the fraud. During the confusion, Victor intended to strike again. That evening, Daniel invited Grace to dinner at his home. It wasn't a formal event. Just the two of them. The mansion felt surprisingly quiet. I expected more people. Daniel smiled. I live alone. No family. My parents passed away years ago. I'm sorry. He nodded. I buried myself in work afterward. Grace looked around the enormous dining room. It must get lonely. Daniel laughed softly. Sometimes. Grace understood loneliness better than most people. She changed the subject. The gardens are beautiful. My mother designed them. You've kept them exactly as she wanted. I couldn't bring myself to change them. Grace smiled. She must have been a wonderful woman. Daniel looked toward the window. She taught me that wealth means nothing if you forget compassion. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Your mother was wise. Daniel looked at her for a moment. I think she would have liked you. Grace felt her cheeks grow warm. Thank you. Unknown to either of them, Victor's car sat parked across the street outside the mansion. From inside, he watched the lights glowing through the dining room windows. His expression hardened as he saw Daniel laughing. He had not laughed like that in years. Victor picked up his phone. It's me. The familiar voice answered. Report. They're growing close. Does she suspect anything? No. Good. Victor looked toward the mansion. But she can't stay. The voice became cold. Then make sure she doesn't. Victor slowly ended the call. He knew exactly what those words meant. This time, however, he wasn't certain he wanted innocent Grace caught in the middle. His hatred belonged to Daniel. Grace had done nothing except save a life. For the first time since beginning his revenge, Victor felt something unfamiliar. A tiny whisper of guilt. He quickly pushed it aside. Revenge demanded sacrifices, even innocent ones. He started the engine and drove into the Lagos night, unaware that every decision he made was bringing him closer to his own downfall. And somewhere inside the city, completely unaware of the danger surrounding her, Grace gently folded the tiny baby clothes she had bought that afternoon, smiling as her unborn son kicked happily beneath her heart. She believed the worst days of her life were behind her. She couldn't have been more wrong. The following Monday began like any other. Golden sunlight poured through the windows of Grace's guest house as she stood in the nursery Daniel had recently helped prepare. The room was simple but beautiful. A white crib stood beside the window, a rocking chair rested in the corner, and tiny baby clothes were neatly folded inside a small wooden wardrobe. Grace gently rubbed her swollen belly. We're almost there, little one, she whispered with a smile. Just a few more weeks. The baby responded with a tiny kick. She laughed softly. You always answer me. For the first time in months, Grace felt hopeful about the future. She no longer worried about where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep. Daniel had given her safety, dignity, and another chance at life. She silently prayed she would never disappoint him. Around 10 o'clock, Helen arrived at the guest house. Good morning. Good morning, Grace replied cheerfully. Helen handed her a folder. Mr. Cole has meetings all afternoon, but he asked if you'd like to spend a few hours at the office. The human resources manager wants to introduce you to some of the software you'll eventually use after your maternity leave. Grace smiled. I'd love that. Within an hour, they arrived at Cole Global Holdings. The towering glass building no longer felt quite as intimidating. The security guards greeted her warmly. Good morning, Miss Grace. Morning, she answered with a smile. Even the receptionist seemed genuinely happy to see her. The baby's getting bigger. Grace laughed. That's what everyone keeps telling me. She slowly made her way upstairs with Helen. The Human Resources Department welcomed her kindly. One employee showed her how to organize digital records. Another explained how internal communication worked within the company. Grace listened carefully, taking notes in a small notebook she carried everywhere. I hope I'm not asking too many questions, she said apologetically. The instructor smiled. Quite the opposite. You ask the right questions. Grace smiled shyly. I just want to learn. By late afternoon, the training session had ended. Helen had already left for another appointment. Daniel was still attending an important board meeting on the top executive floor. Grace decided to wait for him rather than return alone. She wandered quietly through one of the executive corridors, admiring framed photographs that showed the company's earliest construction projects. One picture caught her attention. It showed a much younger Daniel standing beside a group of workers covered in dust. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit. He wore work boots and a hard hat. Everyone around him was smiling. Grace smiled too. He really built all this. She continued walking. The executive floor was unusually quiet. Most employees had already gone home. Only a few lights remained on. As Grace approached the elevators, she suddenly realized she had left her notebook in the training room. Oh no! Turning around, she hurried back. Pregnancy made walking quickly difficult, but she managed. After retrieving the notebook, She once again headed toward the elevators. Halfway there, she heard voices. She wasn't trying to listen. The voices simply echoed through the nearly empty hallway. One voice belonged to Victor. The other was unfamiliar. Grace slowed her steps. Victor stood inside a conference room whose door had been left slightly open. His back faced the hallway. Another man stood near the window speaking quietly. Grace intended to keep walking. Then she heard Daniel's name. She stopped. Victor's voice was calm. "I told you the first attempt failed because someone interfered." The other man sounded impatient. "That homeless woman?" "Yes. She ruined everything." Grace frowned. Her heart skipped a beat. What were they talking about? Victor continued. "Nobody was supposed to find him." The second man shook his head. "The kidnappers assured us the lion would finish the job." Grace's eyes widened. Lion? Kidnappers? Daniel? A cold chill spread through her body. She instinctively stepped closer to the doorway. Victor lowered his voice. "We cannot afford another mistake. What about the board meeting next month?" Victor smiled faintly. "He won't be alive to chair it." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. For a moment she forgot to breathe. They weren't discussing an accident. They were planning murder. Daniel's murder. The second man spoke again. "Are you sure no one suspects you?" Victor laughed quietly. "Daniel trusts me more than anyone. He signs whatever I place before him. And if he asks questions, he won't." Grace covered her mouth with one hand. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Daniel trusted Victor completely. Yet Victor was the very man trying to kill him. Victor reached into his briefcase and removed a file. "The poison has already been arranged." The other man nodded. "When?" "During the charity gala. Thousands of people will be there." "Exactly." In the confusion, everyone will believe he suffered a sudden heart attack. The man smiled. "And afterward?" Victor's eyes hardened. "I become acting chairman until the board elects a permanent replacement. And with our people already on the board." The two men smiled at each other. "It will be easy." Grace felt sick. Everything suddenly made sense. The kidnapping, the lion, Daniel's mysterious enemies. Victor had been behind it all. Grace slowly stepped backward. She needed to leave. She needed to warn Daniel immediately. As she turned, her handbag brushed against a decorative metal vase standing beside the wall. Clink. The sound echoed loudly through the silent corridor. Inside the conference room, both men froze. Victor looked toward the door. "Did you hear that?" The other man nodded. Victor quickly walked toward the entrance. Grace's heart pounded. Without thinking, she hurried around the corner just as the conference room door opened. Victor stepped into the hallway. He looked left, then right. No one. Grace pressed herself against the wall just beyond the corner, hardly daring to breathe. Victor slowly walked farther into the corridor. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. Grace could hear every step. If he came only a little farther, he would find her. Victor stopped beside the decorative vase. It probably fell against the wall. The other man joined him. "You worry too much." Victor frowned. "I don't like surprises." He scanned the hallway once more. Still seeing no one, he finally returned to the conference room. Grace waited. 1 minute, then another. Only after hearing the conference room door close did she move. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. She quietly opened the voice recorder application. She knew she needed proof. Taking a deep breath, she carefully crept back toward the slightly open door. Her heart hammered in her chest. She stretched out her trembling hand just enough for the phone to capture the voices inside. "The poison must never be traced," Victor was saying. "It won't be." "And the woman?" Grace's body stiffened. "The pregnant one?" "Yes. She knows nothing." Victor was silent for a moment. "Even so, we should keep an eye on her. If she becomes a problem." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. Grace's fear deepened. They were talking about her. She forced herself to remain still for a few more seconds before quietly pulling the phone back. She had enough. She turned to leave. Then disaster struck. Her phone slipped from her sweaty fingers. It landed on the polished floor with a loud crack. The voices inside the room stopped instantly. Victor shouted, "Who's there?" Grace snatched up the phone and ran. Behind her, the conference room door burst open. "Stop!" Victor yelled. Grace ignored him. Despite her pregnancy, adrenaline pushed her forward. She hurried toward the elevators, breathing hard. The elevator doors were closing. "No!" She pressed the button repeatedly. Too late. The elevator descended. Behind her, she heard Victor's footsteps growing louder. Without another thought, Grace turned toward the emergency stairwell and pushed open the heavy metal door. She carefully but quickly made her way down the stairs, one hand gripping the railing, the other protecting her belly. Every step echoed behind her. Victor had entered the stairwell. Grace whispered a desperate prayer. "Please, God, let me reach Daniel before he reaches me." She knew one thing with absolute certainty. The trusted assistant everyone admired was not merely disloyal. He was a murderer, and Daniel Cole's life depended on what Grace did next. Grace's heart pounded as she hurried down the emergency staircase, one hand gripping the railing while the other instinctively protected her swollen belly. Every step sent a sharp ache through her lower back, but she refused to stop. Behind her, she could hear footsteps. Victor was following her. She didn't dare look back. All she could think about was reaching Daniel before it was too late. The stairwell echoed with every footstep, making it impossible to tell how close Victor really was. "Grace!" Victor's voice rang through the concrete staircase. "Wait!" She ignored him. Her breathing became heavier. The baby kicked inside her stomach, making her even more anxious. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered between breaths. "Just hold on." She reached the 22nd floor landing and pushed through the heavy fire door. The corridor was almost empty. Only two cleaners were polishing the marble floor. One of them looked up in surprise. "Miss Grace." Grace didn't stop. "Where is Mr. Cole?" "He should still be in the executive boardroom." "Thank you." She hurried toward the elevators. This time, one arrived almost immediately. The doors slid open. She stepped inside and repeatedly pressed the button for the executive floor. Just as the doors were about to close, Victor appeared at the end of the hallway. For a split second, their eyes met. Victor's polite smile was gone. His face was cold, calculating, dangerous. He broke into a run. The elevator doors closed just before he reached them. Grace let out a shaky breath. For the first time since overhearing the conversation, she felt she might actually escape. Victor stood motionless as the elevator disappeared upward. His jaw tightened. "So," he muttered quietly. She heard everything. He pulled out his phone and quickly dialed a number. The call connected almost instantly. "We have a problem." The voice on the other end became serious. "What happened?" The woman overheard the meeting. There was silence. Then, did she hear enough? Victor stared at the elevator display. "Enough. And now, I'm going after her. Don't do anything reckless inside the building." Victor clenched his fists. "If she reaches Daniel." The call ended before he finished speaking. The elevator doors opened. Grace rushed out into the executive reception area. Daniel's secretary looked surprised. "Miss Grace, I need to see Mr. Cole. He's in a board meeting. It's urgent." The secretary hesitated. "They specifically asked not to be interrupted." Grace's voice trembled. "Please, it's a matter of life and death." Something in Grace's face convinced her. Without another word, the secretary hurried into the boardroom. Moments later, the doors opened. Daniel stepped outside. The moment he saw Grace's frightened expression, his smile disappeared. "Grace, what happened?" She looked around nervously. "We need to talk. Now." Daniel immediately nodded. He led her into his private office next door and closed the door behind them. "What is it?" Grace struggled to catch her breath. "I overheard Victor." Daniel frowned. What about him? He wasn't alone. She swallowed hard. They were talking about your kidnapping. Daniel's expression changed. What? They said the lion was supposed to kill you. Silence filled the office. Grace continued. They said the first attempt failed because someone found you. Daniel stared at her without speaking. They're planning another attack. She pulled out her cracked phone. I recorded part of their conversation. Daniel took the phone. His hands remained surprisingly steady. Grace pressed play. Victor's voice filled the office. The poison must never be traced. During the charity gala, Daniel trusts me more than anyone. I become acting chairman. The recording ended. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Daniel slowly sat down. His face had become pale. He looked as though someone had knocked the air from his lungs. Finally, he spoke. I trusted him. Grace quietly nodded. I know. For 10 years. He handled everything. He knew my family, my finances, my personal schedule. His voice became quieter. I treated him like a brother. Grace gently placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry. Daniel looked at her. I should have listened to my instincts. What do you mean? There were things. Small things. Financial reports that didn't quite add up. Meetings he insisted I cancel. Security changes he recommended. I ignored them. I believed he was protecting me. Grace remained silent. She knew this wasn't simply betrayal. It was heartbreak. Daniel suddenly stood. He picked up the office phone. Get Chief Inspector Musa here immediately. Within 30 minutes, Chief Inspector Musa arrived with a small team of detectives. Daniel played the recording. The officers listened carefully. When it finished, the room remained silent. The inspector looked at Daniel. This is serious. Daniel nodded. I want him arrested. The inspector shook his head. Not yet. Grace looked confused. Why? We have evidence of conspiracy, but not enough to guarantee a conviction. Daniel frowned. What do you suggest? The inspector leaned forward. Let him believe no one suspects him. We watch him. We collect more evidence. We catch every person involved. Grace's eyes widened. That sounds dangerous. It is. The inspector nodded. But it's the only way to dismantle the entire network. Daniel folded his arms. And the charity gala? The inspector smiled slightly. We let the gala happen. Grace looked horrified. But they said that's where. We know. The inspector interrupted gently. And because we know, we'll be ready. Over the next several days, everything appeared normal. Victor continued working as though nothing had happened. He attended meetings, prepared reports, accompanied Daniel everywhere. Daniel acted exactly as he always had. He laughed. He discussed business. He thanked Victor for his hard work. Victor never suspected anything. Behind the scenes, however, the police quietly installed hidden cameras throughout the executive offices. Financial investigators examined years of company records. Detectives monitored Victor's phone calls. One discovery led to another. Secret payments, fake consulting contracts, offshore accounts. The evidence grew stronger every day. Grace watched everything unfold from a distance. She rarely visited the office now. Daniel insisted she remain at the guest house where security officers could protect her. You've already risked enough. Grace smiled. I only told the truth. Daniel shook his head. You did much more. You trusted your instincts. 1 week later, the night of the charity gala finally arrived. The grand ballroom glittered beneath magnificent crystal chandeliers. Business leaders, government officials, celebrities, international investors. Hundreds of guests filled the luxurious hall. Elegant music floated through the room. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays. Everything appeared perfect, exactly as Victor had planned. Grace remained in a private observation room upstairs with Inspector Musa and several officers. She looked down through a one-way glass window overlooking the ballroom. Her hands trembled. What if something goes wrong? The inspector smiled reassuringly. It won't. Down below, Daniel greeted guests warmly. Victor stood only a few feet away, smiling politely as always. No one watching them would have guessed they were mortal enemies. One of the waiters approached Daniel carrying a glass of champagne. Victor casually stepped beside the tray. Grace held her breath. She watched Victor remove a tiny vial hidden inside his sleeve. With astonishing speed, he emptied its contents into one glass. Then he calmly picked up that same glass. He turned toward Daniel. Congratulations on another successful year. He extended the poisoned drink. Daniel reached for it. Now, Inspector Musa whispered. Suddenly the ballroom doors burst open. Police! Guests screamed. Music stopped instantly. Detectives flooded the room from every entrance. Victor froze, his face drained of color. Inspector Musa walked directly toward him. Victor Adams, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, fraud, and embezzlement. Victor laughed nervously. This is ridiculous. You have no proof. We do. The inspector nodded toward several officers. One detective carefully took the poison glass. Another produced laboratory results. We recovered identical poison from your office. Victor looked around desperately. His accomplice attempted to flee. Police tackled him before he reached the exit. Guests watched in stunned silence. Daniel slowly stepped forward. He looked directly into Victor's eyes. Why? Victor stared back. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Victor smiled bitterly. You really don't remember? Daniel frowned. What? My father. Recognition slowly appeared on Daniel's face. Samuel Adams? Victor nodded. He lost everything because of you. Daniel shook his head. No. The investment collapsed because your father ignored every warning. Victor laughed bitterly. That's what you tell yourself. He died believing you betrayed him. And I believed him. Daniel's voice softened. I'm sorry your father died. But I never wished him harm. Victor's eyes filled with anger. It doesn't matter anymore. The officers placed handcuffs on him. As they led him away, he looked toward Grace standing beside Inspector Musa. For just a moment their eyes met. Victor gave a slow, defeated smile. You should have left me in that forest. Grace answered quietly, If I had, I wouldn't be able to look at myself today. Victor lowered his head. For the first time in years, he had nothing left to say. As the police escorted him out of the ballroom, the guests erupted into shocked whispers. Daniel turned toward Grace. Their eyes met across the crowded room. He knew the truth. For the second time in his life, Grace had saved him. The first time from a lion. The second time from the man he had trusted most. The dramatic events at the charity gala dominated newspapers and television stations for days. Billionaire CEO survives assassination plot. Trusted executive assistant arrested. Pregnant woman who saved billionaire exposes second murder attempt. Every major news outlet carried the story. Reporters praised Grace as a courageous woman whose quick thinking had saved Daniel Cole's life not once, but twice. Yet Grace wanted none of the attention. She declined every interview. When reporters gathered outside the guest house, she politely thanked them before asking for privacy. I didn't do it for recognition, she told one journalist through the gate. I simply did what I believed was right. Daniel admired her even more. Most people would have enjoyed the fame. Grace wanted only peace. Week after Victor's arrest, life slowly began returning to normal. The police continued investigating everyone connected to the conspiracy. Several corrupt contractors and business associates were arrested after investigators uncovered years of fraud and money laundering. Daniel spent long hours meeting with lawyers and auditors, cleaning up the damage Victor had caused. Despite his busy schedule, he never forgot Grace. Every evening he visited the guest house. Sometimes he brought fresh fruit, sometimes flowers. Other times he simply sat with her on the veranda while they watched the sunset. One evening, Grace laughed as Daniel struggled to assemble a small wooden crib. I thought billionaires hired people to do everything. Daniel looked up from the scattered pieces of wood and smiled. They do. So why are you doing this? Because I'd like to. Grace folded her arms. I don't think you've ever built a crib before. I've built office towers. That's different. It can't be that hard. 5 minutes later, one side of the crib collapsed. Grace burst into laughter. Daniel looked at the crooked pieces before laughing too. I think the instruction manual is judging me. Grace wiped tears of laughter from her eyes. I'll call someone. No. Daniel shook his head with determination. I refuse to be defeated by baby furniture. 3 hours later, after several failed attempts, the crib finally stood upright. Daniel stepped back proudly. There. Grace examined it carefully. It looks wonderful. It better. Daniel sighed dramatically. I've earned this victory. The two of them laughed until their sides hurt. For a brief moment, neither thought about kidnappings, betrayals, or danger. They were simply two friends preparing for the arrival of a child. A few days later, Daniel accompanied Grace to another prenatal appointment. Dr. Amina smiled as she completed the examination. The baby is healthy. Grace smiled with relief. And the mother? The doctor looked directly at her. The mother needs to stop pretending she's stronger than everyone else. Daniel laughed. I've been telling her that. Grace rolled her eyes playfully. You've both formed an alliance against me. Dr. Amina laughed. We only want what's best for you. She looked back at Grace. You're very close now. It could happen at any time. Grace instinctively rested a hand on her stomach. A mixture of excitement and nervousness filled her heart. She had dreamed about this day for months. Yet she was also afraid. She would become a mother. A single mother. Would she be enough? Daniel noticed the concern in her face as they left the hospital. What are you thinking? Grace hesitated. What if I'm not a good mother? Daniel looked surprised. Why would you think that? I've never done this before. He smiled gently. No first-time parent knows exactly what they're doing. Grace laughed softly. I suppose that's true. Daniel stopped walking. He looked directly into her eyes. Grace, your child is already lucky. She blinked. Why? Because he has a mother willing to risk her own life for a complete stranger. If you can love someone you've never met that much, I have no doubt you'll be an incredible mother. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. Thank you. Daniel smiled. I meant every word. That night heavy rain fell across Lagos. Thunder echoed through the city. Grace sat beside the nursery window listening to the rain tapping gently against the glass. She rubbed her belly. I wonder what you'll look like. The baby kicked. She smiled. You really like answering me. Another kick. I hope you're patient. Kick. She laughed. I'll take that as a yes. Suddenly a sharp pain spread across her lower abdomen. She froze. It disappeared after a few seconds. Grace frowned. Probably nothing. She continued reading a children's storybook she had bought earlier that week. 10 minutes later another pain came. Stronger this time. She slowly stood. The pain faded again. Grace remembered what Dr. Amina had explained. The early contractions could begin hours before labor. She looked at the clock. 11:40 p.m. Another contraction struck. This one forced her to grip the edge of the table. She breathed deeply. Oh! Her phone lay on the bedside table. She quickly picked it up and called Daniel. He answered almost immediately. Grace, I think. She paused as another contraction hit. I think it's time. Daniel was already reaching for his car keys. I'm on my way. Less than 15 minutes later, Daniel's car stopped outside the guest house. He rushed inside. Grace was waiting near the front door with a small hospital bag. She smiled nervously. I didn't think babies arrived in the middle of the night. Daniel laughed despite the tension. I don't think they check calendars. Another contraction interrupted them. Grace grabbed his arm. Daniel immediately supported her. We're leaving. The drive to the hospital felt longer than ever. Rain continued pouring heavily. Traffic was surprisingly light because of the late hour. Daniel kept glancing toward Grace. How are you? She managed a weak smile. I've definitely had better evenings. Daniel chuckled softly. I believe you. Dr. Amina was already waiting when they arrived. She quickly examined Grace. You've progressed well. Grace looked nervous. How long? The doctor smiled. Babies don't follow schedules. Daniel gently squeezed Grace's hand. You can do this. Grace nodded bravely. I hope so. The nurses wheeled her toward the delivery room. Daniel instinctively followed. One nurse smiled. The father? Grace quickly answered. No. Daniel hesitated before speaking. I'm family. The nurse smiled kindly. Then you may stay if Miss Grace wants you to. Grace looked at him. Please don't leave. Daniel nodded. I won't. The next several hours felt endless. Grace endured wave after wave of contractions. She squeezed Daniel's hand so tightly he lost feeling in his fingers. Neither of them noticed. Daniel kept encouraging her. You're doing wonderfully. I don't feel wonderful. She groaned. He smiled. I stand corrected. Another contraction came. Grace buried her face in the pillow. I'm never doing this again. One of the nurses laughed. We hear that every day. Daniel couldn't help smiling. You laughed. Grace glared at him. Don't push your luck. Everyone in the room laughed gently. The laughter eased the tension. As dawn approached, Dr. Amina nodded encouragingly. One more push. Grace gathered every bit of strength she had left. She pushed. A tiny cry suddenly filled the room. For one beautiful moment, time seemed to stop. The baby's cry echoed through the delivery room. Grace immediately burst into tears. So that's... She whispered. My baby. The nurse gently lifted a healthy little boy. Congratulations. It's a son. Grace smiled through her tears. Daniel stood silently beside her. He had witnessed many important moments in his life. The opening of billion-dollar projects, international awards, historic business deals. None of them compared to this. The tiny baby wrapped in a soft blanket somehow made everything else seem insignificant. The nurse carefully placed the newborn into Grace's arms. She stared at him in complete amazement. His tiny fingers curled around one of hers. His eyes remained tightly closed. Hello, she whispered. I've been waiting for you. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Daniel quietly stepped closer. May I? Grace smiled and gently handed him the baby. Daniel held the little boy with surprising confidence. The child yawned softly before settling peacefully against his chest. Daniel felt something awaken deep inside his heart. A feeling he had never experienced before. Love. Not because the child was related to him. Not because he had any obligation. Simply because this tiny life mattered. He looked at Grace. He's perfect. Grace nodded. He really is. Daniel gently touched the baby's tiny hand. He'll never have to wonder whether he's loved. Grace smiled gratefully. I'll spend my whole life making sure of that. Daniel looked down at the sleeping infant once more. Quietly, almost without realizing it, he made a promise in his heart. The child who had entered the world that rainy morning would never grow up feeling abandoned the way Grace once had. Whatever the future held, Daniel intended to stand beside both mother and son. Neither of them knew it yet, but that silent promise would soon change all three of their lives forever. Morning sunlight streamed gently through the hospital window, filling the room with a warm golden glow. The heavy rain that had poured throughout the night had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean. Grace lay comfortably on the hospital bed with her newborn son sleeping peacefully in her arms. She couldn't stop looking at him. Every tiny detail fascinated her. His little fingers, his tiny nose, the soft curls of black hair on his head. She smiled every time he yawned or stretched. So you're the little person who kept kicking me all those months, she whispered. The baby opened his eyes for a brief second before drifting back to sleep. Grace laughed quietly. I'll take that as a hello. A gentle knock came at the door. Daniel stepped inside carrying a large bouquet of white lilies. Behind him were Helen and Dr. Amina. Good morning, Mother, Daniel said with a smile. Grace laughed. I still can't believe I'm actually a mother. You wear the title well. Daniel placed the flowers on the bedside table before looking down at the sleeping baby. And how is our little champion today? Grace raised an eyebrow. Our? Daniel chuckled. I've grown rather attached already. Helen smiled knowingly. I noticed. Daniel had barely left the hospital since Grace went into labor. He had canceled meetings, postponed business trips, and delegated important decisions to his senior management team. For a man known for working almost every hour of the day, the change surprised everyone. Dr. Amina completed her examination before smiling warmly. Both mother and baby are doing wonderfully. Grace sighed with relief. Thank God. You'll probably be discharged tomorrow if everything continues this way. After the doctor left, Helen quietly excused herself to answer a phone call, leaving Grace and Daniel alone. Silence settled comfortably between them. Daniel pulled a chair beside the bed. Have you chosen a name? Grace looked down at her son. I've been thinking. What ideas do you have? She smiled. My mother always said names carry prayers. Daniel nodded. I agree. I want his name to remind him that even after the darkest nights, God still brings hope. Daniel smiled thoughtfully. What about Nathan? Grace looked up. It means gift. She repeated it softly. Nathan. The baby stirred slightly. She smiled. I think he likes it. Daniel laughed. I think that's his approval. Grace gently kissed her son's forehead. Then Nathan it is. The following afternoon Grace and baby Nathan were discharged from the hospital. As they stepped outside, dozens of reporters waited beyond the hospital gates. Cameras flashed continuously. Miss Grace, over here. How does it feel to become a mother? Mr. Cole, are the rumors true that you've adopted responsibility for the child? Security officers politely held the crowd back. Grace instinctively looked nervous. Daniel noticed. It's all right. He turned toward the reporters. Please give them some space. One journalist raised his voice. Mr. Cole, is Grace your fiancée? Daniel smiled politely. Today isn't about speculation. It's about a healthy mother and her beautiful son. He gently opened the car door for Grace before getting in beside her. As the vehicle drove away, Grace looked out the window. I never imagined people would care about my life. Daniel looked at her kindly. They're inspired by your courage. She shook her head. I'm just an ordinary woman. No. Daniel smiled. You're an extraordinary woman who believes she's ordinary. Grace laughed softly. I'll never get used to compliments. Back at the guest house, the staff had prepared a small welcome celebration. Blue balloons decorated the living room. Fresh flowers stood on every table. A homemade banner read, Welcome home, baby Nathan. Grace covered her mouth in surprise. You did all this? The housekeeper smiled proudly. We've been waiting all morning. One by one, the staff came forward to congratulate her. Some brought tiny knitted blankets. Others gave children storybooks. The elderly gardener shyly handed Grace a small wooden rocking horse he had carved himself. I made it for him. Grace's eyes filled with tears. It's beautiful. The gardener smiled. I hope he'll play with it one day. That evening, after everyone had left, Grace rocked Nathan gently to sleep. Daniel watched quietly from across the room. You've become very good at that. Grace smiled. I've only been doing it for one day. Still. She looked at him. You've changed too. Daniel laughed. Have I? You smile more. I suppose I do. Nathan suddenly began crying. Grace tried soothing him. He cried louder. She walked around the room, still crying. She checked his blanket. Nothing. Daniel stood. May I try? Grace hesitated before carefully handing him the baby. To her surprise, Nathan stopped crying almost immediately after Daniel gently held him against his shoulder. Within seconds, the baby had fallen asleep. Grace stared in disbelief. That isn't fair. Daniel laughed quietly. I think he likes my heartbeat. Grace smiled warmly. Or maybe he already knows you're one of the safest people in his life. Daniel looked down at the sleeping child. Something stirred inside him again, a feeling he could no longer ignore. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel visited almost every day. He helped feed Nathan, changed diapers, though not very successfully, learned how to prepare baby formula under Grace's patient supervision. One afternoon, Helen walked into the kitchen just as Daniel was struggling with a diaper. She couldn't stop laughing. "Mr. Cole." He looked up helplessly. "I negotiated a Billionaire contract last week." Helen nodded. "I know. I'd rather negotiate another one." Grace burst into laughter. "You've put the diaper on backwards." Daniel looked horrified. "There's a front and back?" Grace laughed even harder. "I'll fix it." Nathan giggled softly as though enjoying the entire performance. The sound filled the room. Daniel froze. "Did he?" Grace smiled. "I think that was his first little laugh." Daniel smiled so broadly his cheeks hurt. It was worth the embarrassment. Despite the joy surrounding the little family, one difficult subject remained unspoken: Nathan's biological father. One afternoon, Grace received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar. She answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end immediately made her heart sink. "Grace." "Peter." She hadn't heard his voice since the day he abandoned her. She remained silent. "I heard you had the baby." Grace answered coldly. "Yes. I'm his father." Her grip tightened on the phone. "You stopped being his father the day you abandoned him." Peter sighed. "I made mistakes. You threw your pregnant wife onto the street. You told me you didn't care whether your child lived or died." Silence. "I wasn't thinking." Grace felt years of pain returning. "No. You were thinking only about yourself." Peter lowered his voice. "I want to see my son." Grace looked toward Nathan sleeping peacefully beside Daniel. "He already has someone who loves him." Without another word, she ended the call. Tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. Daniel noticed immediately. "What happened?" Grace handed him the phone. "It was Peter." Daniel understood instantly. "He wants to come back?" She nodded. "He heard about Nathan." Daniel sat quietly beside her. "You don't owe him anything." Grace wiped her tears. "I know. I just hate remembering that part of my life." Daniel gently placed a reassuring hand over hers. "You don't have to go through it alone anymore." A few days later, Daniel requested that Grace meet him at his mansion. She arrived carrying Nathan. Daniel was waiting in the garden. The roses were in full bloom, and a cool breeze rustled the trees. "You sounded serious," Grace said. "I've been thinking." He looked at Nathan sleeping peacefully in the stroller. "I've never wanted children before." Grace looked surprised. "I always believed work was enough." He smiled sadly. "I was wrong." Grace listened quietly. Daniel took a slow breath. "Grace, I know Nathan isn't my son by blood, but that little boy has somehow found his way into my heart." Grace felt emotion rising inside her. Daniel continued. "I've watched him since the day he was born. I've watched you love him. I've realized something." He knelt beside the stroller and gently touched Nathan's tiny hand. "I don't want him growing up wondering where his father is." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Daniel looked up at her. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to become his father." Grace covered her mouth. "I don't just mean helping financially. I mean legally. I want to adopt Nathan. I want him to carry my name. I want him to know that someone chose him." Tears streamed down Grace's face. Daniel stood. "I'm not asking for anything in return. I don't expect you to marry me. I don't expect you to love me. I simply love that little boy. And I promise you this." He looked directly into Grace's eyes. "As long as I live, Nathan will never feel abandoned." Grace broke down completely. No one had ever offered such unconditional love. Not for money, not for gratitude, simply because of love itself. She looked at her sleeping son, then back at Daniel. With tears still running down her cheeks, she whispered the words that would change all of their lives. "Yes, you can be his father." Daniel smiled through tears of his own. He gently lifted Nathan into his arms. For the first time, he wasn't holding someone else's child. He was holding the son he had freely chosen to love. And in that quiet garden, beneath the warm afternoon sun, a family began to take shape, not through blood, but through sacrifice, loyalty, and a promise that would last a lifetime. A month passed after Daniel began the legal process to adopt baby Nathan. What had started as a simple promise in a quiet garden slowly became reality. The family court carefully reviewed Grace's consent, Nathan's birth records, and Daniel's application. Social workers visited both Daniel's mansion and the guest house. They interviewed the staff, spoke with Dr. Amina, and even questioned Helen about Daniel's character. Every report described the same man: honest, responsible, compassionate, patient. The judge smiled as she closed the final file. "It is not often," she said, "that I see someone willing to become a father simply because he loves a child." A few days later, the adoption became official. Nathan Cole. Daniel held the certificate in his hands, unable to stop smiling. Grace stood beside him with tears running down her face. Nathan slept peacefully in his mother's arms, completely unaware that his future had changed forever. Daniel knelt in front of the little boy. "Welcome to the family, son." Grace quietly wiped another tear away. For the first time since Peter had abandoned her, she no longer feared what tomorrow would bring. Nathan had a father, not by blood, but by choice. Life settled into a peaceful routine. Every morning Daniel stopped by the guest house before going to work. Sometimes he brought breakfast, sometimes toys for Nathan, sometimes nothing at all except himself. He had discovered that fatherhood wasn't measured by expensive gifts. It was measured by presence. One morning Grace walked into the kitchen and found Daniel carefully warming a bottle of milk. "You know the staff can do that." Daniel smiled. "I know." "Then why are you doing it?" "Because fathers feed babies too." Grace leaned against the doorway and watched him. Just a few months earlier she had rescued a stranger from a lion. Now that same man was standing in her kitchen humming a lullaby while warming a bottle. Life truly worked in mysterious ways. Nathan began crying from the living room. Daniel immediately picked him up. "I think someone is hungry." Grace laughed. "I think someone has become an expert. I've had a good teacher." He carefully fed Nathan while talking softly to him. "So," Daniel whispered to the baby, "should we let your mother sleep a little longer tomorrow?" Nathan made a happy little sound. "I'll take that as a yes." Grace smiled. "You two seem to have private conversations." Daniel looked up. "We're discussing important father and son business." At Cole Global Holdings, the atmosphere had changed dramatically since Victor's arrest. The company had hired a new executive assistant named Sarah Okafor, a calm and experienced professional with an excellent reputation. Unlike Victor, Sarah believed in transparency. She insisted every major financial decision be reviewed by multiple departments. Daniel appreciated the changes. One afternoon Sarah entered his office carrying several files. "The final audit is complete." Daniel looked up. "And," she smiled, "we've recovered nearly 80% of the money Victor stole." "That's wonderful. There is one more thing." She placed another file on his desk. "The board of directors would like to honor Grace." Daniel smiled immediately. "They should. They're proposing a special ceremony. For saving your life." Daniel nodded. "I think she'd be embarrassed." Sarah laughed. "I suspect you're right. Then we'll have to convince her." When Daniel mentioned the idea that evening, Grace reacted exactly as he expected. "Oh no." Daniel smiled. "I knew you'd say that. I don't need an award." "It's not about the award." "Then what is it about?" Daniel sat beside her on the veranda. "It's about letting people know that courage can come from anyone." Grace looked toward the garden. "I was only trying to help." "I know. But because you helped." He counted on his fingers. "I'm alive. Nathan has a father. Our company survived. Hundreds of employees kept their jobs." He smiled gently. "Never underestimate the difference one act of kindness can make." Grace looked down quietly. I'll think about it. Daniel grinned. That's progress. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself looking forward to the evenings more than the business day. No board meeting brought him the same joy as hearing Nathan laugh. No successful contract compared to watching Grace smile. One Saturday afternoon, they visited a public park. Nathan, now several months old, sat happily in his stroller watching children play. Grace looked around. You know. What? This is the first peaceful day I've had in years. Daniel smiled. I'm glad. She looked at him. Before I met you, I spent every day wondering how I would survive. And now I wonder what adventure Nathan will find tomorrow. Daniel laughed. That sounds much better. A little girl accidentally dropped her ball near them. Nathan squealed with excitement. Daniel picked up the ball and handed it back. The little girl's mother smiled. Thank you. She glanced between Daniel and Grace. You have a beautiful family. Grace instinctively looked at Daniel. Neither corrected the woman. Instead, they simply smiled. As they continued walking through the park, Grace found herself thinking about those words. A beautiful family, for the first time, felt true. That night, after putting Nathan to sleep, Grace sat alone on the veranda. The moon reflected softly across the quiet garden. She thought about everything that had happened. Peter's betrayal, the abandoned hut, the lion, Daniel, Nathan. It all felt like another lifetime. She heard footsteps behind her. Daniel walked outside carrying 2 cups of tea. I thought you might still be awake. She accepted the cup. Thank you. They sat together in comfortable silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you first saw me tied to that tree, weren't you afraid? Grace laughed softly. Terrified. Then why didn't you run? She looked toward the stars. My parents taught me something. What? If you have the power to save someone, and you choose not to, you'll carry that regret forever. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I've been wondering about something too. Grace smiled. What is it? He hesitated. Why did you never ask me for money? She looked surprised. Should I have? Most people would. Grace shook her head. I didn't save you because you were rich. I saved you because you were human. Daniel lowered his eyes. That's exactly why. He stopped speaking. Grace looked at him. Why what? He smiled nervously. I've spent weeks trying to find the right words. You don't have to. I do. He took a slow breath. When I was tied to that tree, I believed my life was over. Grace listened quietly. Then a young pregnant woman appeared. You had every reason to walk away. You had your own problems. You had nothing. Yet you risked everything for someone you didn't even know. His voice softened. That day, you didn't just save my life. You changed it. Grace felt tears filling her eyes. Daniel continued. I've built companies. I've earned wealth. I've received awards. But meeting you has been the greatest blessing of my life. She looked down, overwhelmed. I've tried to convince myself that what I feel is gratitude. He smiled gently. It isn't. It's love. Grace's heart skipped. Daniel reached into his pocket. There was no expensive ring. No grand display. Only a tiny wooden bird. The same carving little Kofi had given Grace before she left the village. Daniel smiled. I asked Helen to visit Umudara. Kofi wanted you to have this. Grace gently took the little wooden bird. She immediately recognized it. It reminds you where your journey began. Daniel looked into her eyes. Grace, I love you. I love Nathan. I don't need an answer tonight. I only want you to know the truth. Grace felt tears roll down her cheeks. For months she had quietly fought the feelings growing inside her. She admired Daniel. She trusted him. She cared deeply for him. But fear always held her back. What if she wasn't worthy? What if people believed she only wanted his wealth? As if reading her thoughts, Daniel spoke again. You don't owe me anything. If your answer is no, I'll still be Nathan's father. I'll still protect both of you. Nothing changes. Grace looked at the tiny wooden bird in her hands. Then she remembered the broken hut, the forest, the lion, the lonely billionaire who had shared plain cassava with her. She realized something. Daniel had never tried to impress her with money. He had won her heart with kindness. She stepped closer. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been afraid." Daniel nodded. "I know. I thought people would say I loved your wealth." He smiled gently. "Let them talk. They don't know our story." Grace laughed through her tears. "No, they don't." She reached out and gently took his hands. "I don't love your money. I love the man who stayed beside me while I gave birth. The man who chose my son. The man who kept every promise he ever made." Daniel's eyes filled with emotion. Grace smiled. "And I love you too." For a moment neither of them moved. Then Daniel slowly wrapped his arms around her. They stood together beneath the moonlight, holding each other in grateful silence. Inside the house, little Nathan stirred in his crib before settling back to sleep. His parents smiled at the familiar sound. Their journey had begun with fear, sacrifice, and unimaginable hardship. Now, at last, it had led them to something neither had expected when they first met in that lonely forest. Home. The morning after Grace accepted Daniel's heartfelt confession, she woke before sunrise. For a few quiet moments, she simply sat beside Nathan's crib, watching her little boy sleep peacefully. His tiny chest rose and fell with each gentle breath. She smiled. So much has changed. Just months earlier, she had been sleeping on the cold floor of an abandoned hut, uncertain whether she and her unborn child would survive another week. Now she stood in a warm home filled with love. Not because she had searched for wealth, not because she had chased success, but because she had chosen kindness when fear would have been easier. Nathan stirred and opened his eyes. "There you are," Grace whispered, lifting him into her arms. The little boy smiled as soon as he saw her. "You always know how to brighten my day." A knock sounded at the front door. Grace already knew who it was. Daniel. He rarely arrived without first calling. But today was different. When she opened the door, she found him standing there with a small basket filled with fresh bread, fruit, and flowers. "Good morning." Grace smiled warmly. "You've made this a habit." Daniel laughed. "I was hoping you wouldn't mind." "I don't." Nathan reached his tiny hands toward Daniel. Daniel immediately took him into his arms. "Well, someone seems happy to see me." Grace folded her arms playfully. "I'm beginning to think he likes you more than me." Daniel grinned. "I think he likes whoever feeds him." Grace laughed. That might be true. As they shared breakfast together, neither of them could stop smiling. Everything felt lighter. The weight of fear that had hung over them for months had finally disappeared. Victor was awaiting trial. The company was stable again. Nathan was healthy. And for the first time, Grace allowed herself to imagine a future filled with happiness. A week later, Daniel invited Grace to lunch at the gardens behind his mansion. The roses were blooming beautifully, and a cool breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the air. Nathan slept peacefully in his stroller nearby. Daniel looked unusually nervous. Grace noticed immediately. "You've negotiated billion-dollar contracts." He smiled awkwardly. "Yes, but today you're nervous." "A little." She laughed softly. "Why?" Instead of answering, Daniel reached into his pocket. This time he removed a small velvet box. Grace's eyes widened. Daniel slowly knelt on one knee. "When I first met you, I thought I was going to die. You gave me another chance at life." He looked toward Nathan. "Then you gave me something I never expected. A family." Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. Daniel opened the small box. Inside rested a simple but elegant diamond ring. Not enormous, not flashy, beautiful in its simplicity. "I don't want to spend another day imagining my future without you in it." He smiled gently. "Grace, will you marry me?" Grace covered her mouth with both hands. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks. She looked from Daniel to Nathan, then back again. Every painful memory flashed through her mind. Peter abandoning her, The lonely nights, the hunger, the broken hut, the lion, the hospital, Nathan's birth. Every hardship had somehow led her to this moment. She laughed through her tears. I've already answered once. Daniel looked confused. What do you mean? I told you I loved you. She held out her left hand. My answer is yes. Daniel carefully slipped the ring onto her finger. Fit perfectly. He stood and gently embraced her. Nathan chose that exact moment to wake up. He looked at both of them before smiling happily. Daniel laughed. I think he approves. Grace smiled. I think so too. News of their engagement spread quickly. Employees throughout Cole Global Holdings celebrated the announcement. The reception staff decorated the lobby with flowers. Helen hugged Grace so tightly she almost couldn't breathe. I've been waiting for this. Grace laughed. You knew. Helen smiled knowingly. Everyone knew except the two of you. Daniel walked past at that moment. What are you talking about? Helen grinned. Nothing. Daniel shook his head. I don't believe either of you. Wedding preparations began almost immediately. Grace wanted a small ceremony. Daniel respected her wishes. However, there was one problem. Almost everyone wanted to attend. Company employees, business partners, village elders from Umudara, the doctors and nurses who had cared for Grace, the security officers who had searched for Daniel. Even the cleaners and gardeners from the company requested invitations. They've become family, Grace said. Daniel nodded. Then they'll be there. Grace insisted on one more thing. I want Mama Esther and little Kofi sitting in the front row. Daniel smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. A special company jet flew them from the village to Lagos. For Mama Esther, it was the first airplane ride of her life. She clutched the armrest tightly during takeoff. Kofi laughed. We're flying. Mama Esther smiled nervously. I've noticed. When they arrived, Grace hugged them both tightly. You came. My child, Mama Esther said warmly. I wouldn't miss this day for anything. The wedding day finally arrived. The church was decorated with white roses and soft golden ribbons. Sunlight streamed beautifully through the stained glass windows. Gentle music filled the air as guests slowly took their seats. Daniel waited near the altar. Despite all his confidence in business, his hands trembled slightly. His best man smiled. Nervous. Daniel laughed quietly. Very. You've faced kidnappers. I know. This somehow feels harder. Across town, Grace stood before a large mirror wearing an elegant white wedding gown. The dress wasn't covered in expensive jewels. Instead, it reflected her own personality. Simple, graceful, beautiful. Helen adjusted her veil. You look incredible. Grace smiled nervously. I've never worn anything like this. Mama Esther gently took Grace's hands. You've always been beautiful. Today, everyone else finally gets to see it. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for believing in me when almost no one else did. Mama Esther embraced her. I only reminded you of what God already knew. Outside, the wedding procession began. The church doors slowly opened. Everyone stood. Daniel looked toward the entrance. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. Grace walked down the aisle holding a small bouquet of white lilies. Nathan, dressed in a tiny cream-colored suit, was carried by Helen just behind her. Soft smiles filled every face. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off Grace. She looked radiant, not because of the dress, but because peace had finally replaced the sadness that once filled her eyes. When she reached the altar, Daniel whispered, You look beautiful. Grace smiled. So do you. The pastor began the ceremony. He spoke about love, about sacrifice, about forgiveness. Then he smiled at the couple. Most marriages begin with a love story. He paused. Yours began with courage. Guests smiled. Many wiped tears from their eyes. The vows came next. Daniel looked into Grace's eyes. I promise to love you when life is easy, and when it is difficult. I promise to honor the courage that brought us together. I promise to protect you and Nathan. I promise that our home will always be filled with kindness. Grace smiled through her tears. Then she spoke. I promise to stand beside you. Not because of your wealth, but because of your heart. I promise to remind you to rest when you work too much. Laughter filled the church. I promise to love you with the same honesty that first led me into that forest. And I promise that no matter what life brings, we will face it together. The pastor smiled warmly. By the authority given to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Applause filled the church. Daniel gently kissed Grace. The guests erupted into cheers. Nathan laughed loudly from Helen's arms, making everyone laugh even harder. The reception took place in the beautiful gardens outside Daniel's mansion. Music filled the evening air. Children played across the lawns. Employees, villagers, business leaders, and friends sat together without distinction. Grace walked over to Mama Esther. I never got to thank you properly. The elderly woman smiled. You already have. No. Grace gently held her hands. If you hadn't shared your food, if you hadn't encouraged me to come to Lagos, I wouldn't be standing here today. Mama Esther smiled with tears in her eyes. You saved a man's life. God simply opened the door afterward. Later that evening, Daniel stood before the guests with a microphone. I'd like to say something. The crowd became quiet. He looked toward Grace. When people hear our story, they often say I rescued Grace. He shook his head. The truth is exactly the opposite. He smiled warmly. She rescued me. First from a lion, then from betrayal, and finally. He looked lovingly at Grace and then at little Nathan. From a lonely life without a family. The guests applauded loudly. Grace wiped away another happy tear. As fireworks illuminated the night sky above the gardens, she looked around at the people celebrating with them. Months ago, she had believed her life was over. Now she was surrounded by love, friendship, and hope. She quietly thanked God for every painful step that had brought her to this moment. Because sometimes, the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. 5 years later, the first rays of the morning sun spread across the city of Lagos, bathing the glass towers and busy streets in a warm golden light. Inside the Cole family home, laughter echoed through the hallways. 5-year-old Nathan Cole raced through the living room wearing a superhero cape made from an old towel. I'm faster than the wind, he shouted. Daniel laughed as he chased after him. Are you? Nathan giggled. You'll never catch me. He darted around the sofa before hiding behind Grace, who was setting the breakfast table. Grace folded her arms with a playful smile. I believe this house has a rule. Nathan peeked out from behind her. What rule? No running before breakfast. Nathan pretended to think about it. Maybe. Daniel finally caught him and lifted him high into the air. I've captured the superhero. Nathan laughed so loudly that even the house staff couldn't help smiling. Grace watched them with a grateful heart. 5 years earlier, she had wondered whether her son would ever know the love of a father. Now she couldn't imagine a better father than Daniel. Every school event, every doctor's appointment, every bedtime story. Daniel had never missed one. Not once. After breakfast, Nathan hurried upstairs to get ready for school. Grace poured coffee for Daniel. You have an important meeting today. Daniel nodded. I do. But it can wait until after I drop Nathan off. Grace smiled. You still refuse to let the driver take him. Daniel laughed. I only get one chance to watch him grow up. I'm not missing it. Grace reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. You've kept every promise you ever made. Daniel smiled warmly. So have you. Although Daniel remained one of the country's most successful businessmen, his priorities had changed dramatically. Years earlier, work had consumed every waking hour. Now his calendar looked different. School plays, family dinners, weekend outings, vacation time. The board members had initially questioned his decision to reduce his workload. Instead of hurting the company, it made Cole Global Holdings even stronger. Daniel had learned to trust capable people instead of trying to do everything himself. Employees noticed the change. The company became known not only for its success but also for treating workers with dignity and compassion. Many quietly credited Grace. Her kindness had influenced Daniel more than any business consultant ever could. Grace had also found a new purpose. Not long after their wedding, she and Daniel established the Grace Hope Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping homeless mothers, abandoned women, and vulnerable children. What began as a small charity soon grew into a nationwide movement. The foundation built emergency shelters, provided free prenatal care, offered job training, helped women start small businesses. Most importantly, it restored hope. Grace personally visited every new shelter before it opened. She wanted to make sure each woman felt respected. Never make anyone feel like charity is a favor, she often reminded the staff. Treat them like family. One afternoon, she visited the foundation's newest shelter on the outskirts of Lagos. As she walked through the building, she noticed a young pregnant woman sitting quietly in a corner, staring at the floor. The woman looked frightened. Grace recognized that expression immediately. She had once worn it herself. Grace sat beside her. "My name is Grace." The young woman looked up nervously. "I'm Amina." Grace smiled gently. "Would you like to tell me your story?" Tears immediately filled Amina's eyes. "My husband left when he found out I was pregnant." Grace quietly took her hand. "I understand." The young woman looked surprised. "You do?" Grace nodded. "I've walked that road." She spent the next hour listening instead of talking. By the time Grace stood to leave, Amina was smiling for the first time in weeks. As Grace walked toward her car, one of the social workers smiled. "You always know exactly what to say." Grace looked back at the shelter. "I don't. I just remember what I needed someone to say to me." Meanwhile, Nathan was becoming a remarkable little boy. He loved reading adventure books. He adored animals. He asked endless questions about everything. One Saturday morning, he looked at an old family photograph hanging in the hallway. It showed Grace standing beside the abandoned hut in Umadara village shortly before leaving for Lagos. "Daddy!" Daniel looked up from his newspaper. "Yes. Where is that house?" Daniel smiled. "That's where your mother used to live." Nathan's eyes widened. "Really?" Grace joined them. "It wasn't much." Nathan looked confused. "But why didn't you live here?" Grace knelt beside him. "Because we didn't have this house then." "Were you poor?" Grace nodded honestly. "Very poor." Nathan thought quietly for a moment. Then he asked the question both parents knew would eventually come. "What happened to my first father?" The room became silent. Daniel looked toward Grace. She smiled gently. "I think he's old enough to know." Nathan climbed onto the sofa between them. Grace spoke softly. "The man who helped bring you into the world made some very bad choices. He left before you were born." Nathan looked down. "Didn't he love me?" Daniel gently placed an arm around the little boy. "He never had the chance to know you." Nathan looked up. "But you chose me." Daniel smiled warmly. "Yes. Every single day." Nathan wrapped his arms tightly around Daniel. "I'm glad you're my daddy." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "So am I." Grace quietly wiped away her own tears. It was the answer she had prayed her son would one day give. Several months later, the family traveled back to Umadara village. It had been years since Grace's last visit. Much had changed. The dusty road had been paved. A new health clinic stood near the village entrance. Children attended a modern primary school built by the Grace Hope Foundation. The villagers welcomed them with singing and dancing. Mama Esther, now much older but still energetic, hugged Grace tightly. "My daughter, I've missed you." Grace smiled through happy tears. "I've missed you too." Little Kofi was little no longer. He was now a confident young man studying engineering at a university on a scholarship funded by Daniel and Grace. "You kept your promise," Grace told him proudly. Kofi smiled. "I wanted to build things that help people. You inspired me." Grace shook her head. "You did that yourself." That afternoon Grace quietly slipped away from the celebration. She followed the familiar path toward the forest. Daniel noticed and gently took Nathan's hand. "Come. I want to show you something." Together they walked behind Grace. Soon they reached the old clearing. The giant tree still stood exactly where it had years before. The ropes were gone. The forest had become peaceful once again. Nathan looked around curiously. "Why did we come here?" Grace rested one hand against the old tree. Her eyes filled with memories. "This is where everything changed." Daniel smiled. "This is where your mother saved my life." Nathan's eyes became wide. "From what?" Grace laughed softly. "A lion." Nathan gasped. "A real lion?" Daniel nodded. "A very real lion." Nathan looked at his mother with complete admiration. "My mummy is the bravest person ever." Grace smiled. "I was terrified." "Then why didn't you run?" She looked down at her son. "Because sometimes courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right even when you're afraid." Nathan thought carefully before nodding. "I want to be brave like you." Daniel smiled. "You already have the best example." The three of them stood quietly beneath the old tree. The wind gently rustled the leaves overhead. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered the frightened young woman she had once been. Hungry, homeless, pregnant, alone. If someone had told that woman she would one day return here with a loving husband and a happy son, she would never have believed it. Life had not been easy. It had been painful, cruel at times. But every hardship had shaped the person she became. As they turned to leave, Grace took one last look at the tree. She silently thanked God. Not for the wealth, the mansion, or the success. She was grateful for something far greater. The courage to help a stranger. Because one act of kindness had transformed countless lives. As the family walked back toward the waiting villagers, Nathan slipped one small hand into Grace's and the other into Daniel's. The setting sun painted the sky with brilliant shades of orange and gold. Grace looked at the two people beside her and smiled. Many believed her greatest treasure was marrying a billionaire. They were wrong. Her greatest treasure had never been Daniel's fortune. It was the family they had built together through love, sacrifice, forgiveness, and unwavering faith. And that was a treasure no amount of money could ever buy. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from.